Welcome to the Take Two Initiative podcast, where we dive into important conversations around mental health and wellness. In today's episode, we're joined by Alex Anshantv, a licensed therapist with expertise in helping individuals navigate anxiety and depression. Together, we'll explore the specifics of these mental health challenges, offering insight into how they appear, practical strategies for managing them, and ways to foster resilience, especially in teenagers. With that being said, let's dive in. So, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you our first question.
Yeah, let's jump right in.
Okay. So, our first question is, what influenced you to pursue a career in therapy?
Okay. Um, so for me specifically, it was some experiences that I had in my own family when I was a teenager. And I am the oldest of four kids, and I saw how some of the family stuff that we went through impacted each of like me and my siblings so differently. And then that was kind of like my first thought of like, and I was in therapy for a short bit during that time. So again, like my first experience with that, kind of getting a feel for what that was like, and then recognizing just as I continued to get older and met more people and had some other adult experiences, recognizing how important that somebody like a therapist could be for people who are going through difficult things, somebody who's not a friend, somebody who's not a family member, who's not biased, how helpful that could be in learning how to navigate hard challenges in our lives. So I wanted to be that type of person for people.
I really like that answer. I feel like that's a very admirable sort of stance to take, helping other people, just like being like an unbiased sort of opinion. I really like that. Another question about your career. What is your career specifically and what do you specialize in?
Yep. I have my training in marriage and family counseling. And I mean, it sounds like what it is, but there's the other aspect to it, which I think can be missed by people when you see like licensed marriage and family therapists, is that I don't just specialize in working with people who are married, or just specialize in people who are in some type of family in a family or have like a family dynamic that's challenging. But the way that I describe my approach to people is I'm a relational therapist. So whether it's if I can be working with someone individually who is struggling with, if it's challenges with friends at school, or if it's someone struggling with something at work, like we're in so many different types of relationships, outside of just the people who we interact with on a daily basis. And so helping people realize how those relationships, which whatever they might be, how they can impact the way that we feel about ourselves and the way that our bodies can respond to stress in certain circumstances.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So I know you work with a lot of people, you work in relationships. I'm sure you work with other therapists as well. And so I think you'd be a good judge on this. What are some qualities that you think are important for a therapist to possess?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a hard one, and one that for me anyway, that I learned just through gaining experience is how to check our own beliefs at the door. Um, it's good to be aware of the things that we believe in as people, and to recognize that not everybody has those same beliefs or values, and to be able to hold space for somebody who might think in a different way without passing a judgment or kind of guiding therapy, um, in a way that moves people away from the things that they truly believe in. And that can be challenging to do depending on what you're talking about. Um, the other thing that I think is super important is for a therapist to be able to understand the different types of contributors to the reason why somebody might be feeling a certain way, whether it's where they live or their financial circumstances, the different types of stress that people have in their lives outside of just whatever kind of the presenting problem is. There's so many other things that can make navigating these challenges easier or harder for people. And so being able to really take a zoomed out, like thorough approach to understanding the contributors to the reasons why people are struggling is super important. It's not typically just, or usually it's not just one thing for
Mhm.
somebody.
Yeah, and I think it's really, like, interesting, and especially, like, your job is so I feel like it's so difficult because you have to be unbiased and you have to know, like, every circumstance, or you at least have to be aware of other things and, like, what could be affecting other people, and so I think that's, like I mean, obviously, that's a very hard job, and it's one I think that you must do very well. So
I mean, it's definitely hard and it depends on the day too. But the one thing that I have found myself really grateful for is how much perspective that it's given me. And just different ways of thinking that I wouldn't otherwise be exposed to in different types of lifestyles and um, just like thought processes. So I feel grateful in that way because I'm also learning from people as well. So
Yeah, of course. I mean, that must be, like, such an interesting experience. Well, I'd like to ask you another question. So as a therapist, I mean, I'm sure you, like, talk to a lot of people about self-care and how to care for your mind and your body and things like that. So how would you, as a therapist, define self-care, and how do you utilize it in your own
that's a really great question, especially in this, I guess, kind of climate that we're in with social media and self care has kind of become a buzzword, which I think is great. And I also think it sometimes gets misconstrued about what true self care can really be.
Mhm,
And for me, the definition of self care is being aware of the things that like any individual needs on a given day. Based on how they're feeling, kind of what's going on, and then being able to take care of ourselves, whether it's um, sleep it like do we need to get more sleep, do we need to
mhm,
eat a little bit more, do we need to like those specific things, and being able to check in with ourselves on a regular basis to see if where we need to kind of modify one thing versus another. I mean, it's great for people to go and get a massage or go to like a workout class or like get our nails done or something like that. And that's not going to like those are nice things to do, but
mhm,
it's also unrealistic for someone to prescribe going and getting a manicure as that's going to help you get over your anxiety about whatever the circumstance is, right? It's a form of relaxation, or it can be a form of relaxation for people. And I'm not going to prescribe that as something for somebody to do every day because it's
mhm,
not sustainable. And it also doesn't attend to some of those basic needs. Again, sleeping, eating. Are you hydrated? Are you getting enough movement?
mhm,
Are you getting sunlight? Like those types of things are they're things that our bodies need to be able to function at their like closer to their like their best potential.
mhm,
And so really helping people consider how those more of those basic need type behaviors or um, prescriptions, for lack of a better word right now, how those things go a lot further in terms of self-care than some of the other things that are kind of being screamed at us to go and do for ourselves when we're not feeling great.
yeah, exactly, and I really liked you used the word buzzword for self-care, and I think that's a really interesting word, especially today with social media, and I feel like also, I mean, in the topic of buzzwords, I feel like anxiety and depression have been used a lot lately, especially in social media and things like that, so I wanna ask you, how would you define depression and how would you define anxiety?
So again, another really good question. There are clinical definitions of what anxiety and depression are, which are super helpful in allowing people to get like a general sense of what that can look like. And I think sometimes people rely too heavily on that to be like the end all be all definition of what it can look like, because it really does depend on the person on how anxiety and depression presents. So generally speaking, like when I first work with people, this is kind of like the first layer of assessment, I guess, that I use in trying to like help them identify, like, do you have more one than the other, do you have a mix
Mhm,
of both? Is depression is when your body and your mind are literally in a more depressed state. they're not working um, they're not working at their kind of baseline level, they're working below.
mhm,
So that can look like a lack of motivation. It can be um, lack of interest in things that people or that they used to enjoy. It's withdrawing from certain relationships, or if it's slacking in grades, which normally like isn't an issue. It can be irritable mood, anything that is a little bit more on the negative side of like of a symptom than what somebody typically possesses or presents. And then anxiety is the opposite, where it's a heightened state. So it could be agitation, it could also be irritability. It can be like your heart racing, sweating, like feeling shaky. It's when your body is literally in some form of overdrive. Um, and what also people sometimes also miss is that there can be a combination of both, because usually people's body, we have a threshold where we can only function in that heightened anxious state for so long before you swing to the other side of it, where your body's like, I've got nothing left. And that's when you then typically see some more of the depression, more negative symptoms for some time until they can regain baseline. So there's you a lot of times you see a little bit of both. Um,
Mhm.
Sometimes people call them cousins. Anxiety and depression
Aw,
are, yeah.
I love that. Oh, that's great. So, I mean, I know that anxiety and depression are related, at least in like some form. You called them cousins, which I think is so adorable. But I was just wondering, how does anxiety and how does depression manifest in teenagers differently than adults? Because, we want to focus on teenagers today. And why do you think it's important that we target these signs of declining mental health in teenagers especially?
Yeah. Um, for me, it's a hard question to answer specifically in terms of teenagers versus adults, because in my experience anyway, anxiety and depression presents differently across people just in general.
Mhm,
And that can be for a variety of reasons, which kind of jumping back to my point earlier, and for a therapist to be able to really take into consideration all the influences on the way that somebody's symptoms present.
mhm,
Um, if you grew up in a family where emotional expression was not, it was not welcomed or encouraged, somebody who might be anxious may not show their anxiety outwardly. They might internalize it, and that can look very different from somebody who is the anxious type, buzzing around, like can never sit down, always kind of like restless, needs to be doing something. And so easily, like we could slap a label on it, whether you're a
mhm,
teenager or a kid, and you could be missing a whole nother side of the story. So for me, I don't work from an approach that kind of defines like teenagers look like this, adults
mhm,
look like this when it comes to their symptoms. I try and gather as much information to get a real thorough understanding of, okay, what is contributing to the way that your symptoms are or aren't presenting, and what could this indicate about how you're feeling. um, what Another piece that I do think is important to decipher as far as teenagers, that I think sometimes gets overlooked too, both overlooked and underlooked, depending on the circumstances. There's so much happening for teenagers from a growth perspective. You're
mhm,
talking social and emotionally and like physically as teenagers. And so to really be able to understand like what's maybe a more expected developmental response from somebody from an emotional standpoint based on this really big growth like growth period or developmental cycle that
mhm,
happens. And how do you know if it's something that is just transitional or adjustment based versus something that could turn into something more chronic? And there's no right answer in that. It's again like individualized treatment is the best, or in my is like a really good way to be able to kind of differentiate what's what,
mhm.
um, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, that totally makes sense. And I know you were saying like a big part of it is like that teenagers there's so much going on, they're like growing, and you mentioned specifically like in the social aspect. And so I know like obviously, especially in the last 5 years with the pandemic, the social media like buzz has sort of been like crazy and like totally rapid. Like, and with that, I mean like these social media, like I don't even know, like these like therapist accounts that are, self-diagnosing and stuff like that. And so I was just wondering, like, how do things like that, like social media and those type of accounts, how do they like play, how do you think they play into the mental health of teenagers and things like that?
Yeah. It's tough because it's again like hard to differentiate what's what based on what you're seeing on social media. And I think that social media, in one sense, has given people language to
Mm-hmm.
understand maybe some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. And there also has been I think, an overgeneralization of who has depression, who has this, who
Mm-hmm.
has that, based on what people are reading about online. And as a relational therapist, I appreciate diagnoses to understand symptoms. However, I don't always believe that it is beneficial for somebody,
Mm-hmm.
and especially when it comes to like figuring out a treatment plan of how to work on somebody's like declining mental
Mm-hmm.
health. Slapping a label on it doesn't mean that you're getting the best treatment, or like just because you're reading a set of criteria doesn't mean that you fit that criteria full blown.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think again, like it feels good to have an understanding of what we might be experiencing, but oftentimes I think it does get overgeneralized as to he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist, they have
Mm-hmm.
ADD. Like it can become a rabbit hole. So it's a double-edged sword in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that like social media and like the prevalence of it as a whole, do you think that like it negatively or like more positively affects teenagers today?
Um, that's another really good question. And I think it's, again, very individualized. The biggest challenge that, again, from like a developmental standpoint, which I think that this dynamic exists outside of social media, but social media, I believe, has certainly exacerbated it, is this, especially like in adolescent years, there's a big social push to find a group that we fit in with. This like idea of sameness, like people who look like us, who think like us, who dress like us. There's that piece of it,
Mhm,
which is it's a survival skill. And there's also a social pressure, right? Like people are figuring out what they're going to do with their lives after high school. And so there's a really also big push at the same time to be unique, right? If you're applying to
mhm,
colleges, like you need to stand out on a piece of paper amongst hundreds of thousands of other people. And so how can you, for a teenager, for an adult, how can you really work on finding like your people who are quote unquote the same, that
mhm,
like you feel good and fit in with, at the same time trying to be that unique individual that stands out in these other ways to help you move towards whatever is next for you after high school. And that can be really challenging to do, and especially with peer pressure and bullying and the cyberbullying now, it just makes it that much harder of a process, like emotionally, for people.
mhm. Yeah. Well, I totally agree. And I just want to say that was our last question, and I just want to say thank you so much because I know we're on a time constraint. But thank you so much, and thank everyone so much for tuning in to today's conversation. Thank you, Miss Alex Ashant, for coming on to the podcast today. We hope that you found it helpful and that it offered some valuable insights on managing anxiety and depression. And if you're struggling, remember that you're not alone, and reaching out for support is a powerful step towards healing. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found today's discussion helpful, share it with a friend who might benefit from it. And take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time on the Take Two Initiative podcast.